Welcome to the Education Corner, a podcast by Education Choices magazine.
Education Corner podcast would like to welcome Mr. Will Goldsmith, head of Bedales School in Hampshire. Bedales is a co-educational day and boarding school for students aged 3 to 18, located in 120 acres of South Downs National Park. Founded in 1893 as an alternative to the typical Lake Victorian public schools, Bedales maintains its free-thinking and welcoming environment. There are no uniforms, and staff and pupils address each other by their first names, demonstrating the priority given to individuality within the school community. Will Goldsmith has been at Bedales since 2021 and has previously worked at schools including Stowe and Latimer Upper School in London. It's a pleasure to have you on our podcast.
Thanks for having me, Chloe. I'm excited to talk things through with you.
Firstly, can you tell us about your background and how you came to be head at Bedales?
I think it's always interesting to understand the educational experience that educators have themselves. So I was initially educated actually in an international school in Kuala Lumpur at Alice Smith School. I then, after that, spent a couple of years in a state primary school in Guildford, just down the road from where you went to school for secondary school, I think, Chloe. For then 10 years after that, I was at boarding school in Kent, first at Yardley Court and then at Tunbridge School, both all-boys boarding schools. My father was an expatriate, so we moved around a lot. So that was a really crucial thing in terms of my own education, certainly in terms of my schooling. University was Edinburgh with a year abroad in Barcelona. And then I spent 5 years actually before I became a secondary school teacher, working in education, but much more in either adult education as a teacher of English as a foreign language in Paris, or working as an administrator with American universities, both in London and Paris. So I've always been in education, but it was quite good actually not going headlong into teaching. The nature of the vocation is very much a vocation for me. It is one which it can sometimes be quite all-consuming, but for me, happily so. And I do use the word vocation deliberately because unlike, I think, many people in the 21st century, my career is something which is, or has been certainly since I became a teacher, a constant. I've worked both in the state sector and the independent sector. I've worked in now 6 different schools. My first 3 were state schools, all sort of high-performing schools, 2 in London, 2 comprehensive schools in West London, and then a state grammar school in Buckinghamshire. And then latterly, as you said, Stowe, Latimer Upper and Bedales. And I suppose the final bit of the question, how I came to be a head, I suppose there's different answers. They might be slightly surprising. One, I became a head by accident in that I wasn't expecting to do so. And I suppose the second thing to say would be that I sort of came to be head at Bedales because I fell in love with the place in terms of both its ethos and its approach and what I love about the intellectual and understanding of education that is hardwired into the place, but also the spirit of the place. And I think that's one of the reasons why, after being acting head for a short period of time, I was then successful in becoming the permanent head in February 2022.
And your school motto is work of each for a weal of all. Could you tell us more about the meaning of this motto and the ethos and values that you've mentioned already that are fairly unique at Bedales?
I suppose we plough a middle way between Latin mottos, which you find maybe in older schools, which require translation in the 21st century, and then ones which are maybe even more modern than ours. So the first thing one has to do when you're reading our motto is to understand what the word weal is. It's connected with the idea of wealth, like a commonwealth. But I suppose the word benefit is a good way of translating it. So it's all about the work of individuals, the work of each, for the benefit, for the weal of everyone. And I suppose within our kind of founding ethos, we've got this duality between individuality, which you talked about in your introduction, but also this sense of community. And there is this constant interplay that we explore in how we curate the education of all of our students and how we are as a community more broadly, in terms of balancing the needs of an individual versus the needs of a community. In doing so, we are obviously developing the individual child, but we are also helping them understand their place initially within a relatively small community, but they can take the lessons they learn with us here and then translate those to the wider world. And particularly in an age where our understanding of our humanity is all the more important, that kind of extra dimension they get through the understanding of all, of community, of their position as an individual in a collective, is something which we feel really strongly is essential, although it was equally important in 1893 when we were founded.
Bedales was founded as a deliberately liberal and alternative school by John Badley. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
In 1893, who was a contemporary of Steiner and Montessori. Could you tell us more about the history of the school and Baddeley's legacy at the school today?
Yes, you're right. John Baddeley was the founding head, although he worked very closely with a couple of other colleagues and their partners. So there was a kind of a quartet of men and women who were really influential in terms of the early days of the school. It started, really small, actually, over near Haywards Heath. That's where the original name of the school comes from. It was actually the name of the house that the school first rented when it was in its early stages as a late 19th century startup. And as you said in your introduction, it was very much inspired by Baddeley's own experiences, amongst others, of the 19th century public school education system, particularly in this case, single-sex boys' education. And it came from his feeling, and one which still exists today, because what one sees in education is there's a lot of things that go around. There is obviously progress in society, but there are many things which are cyclical alongside that sense of progress. And so his ideas are still very relevant to us today, particularly at a time when the cycle has got to a point where it feels like both in the state sector and to a lesser extent in the private sector, in the UK certainly, the amount of control and authority that is exercised within schools is at a very high level, and the amount of agency or individuality that is open to young people is at a very low level. One always has to be careful about swinging the pendulum the other extreme, and that is something we work very hard to avoid. But certainly Baddeley's pushback was that there was an excessive amount of authority. There was an excessive imbalance towards certain types of learning, that actually there was too much focus maybe on purely focusing on what you might call head learning, so just the intellectual, to the expense of thinking about heart learning, so the creative, the emotional intelligence that we know is really important, that understanding, as I said earlier, of the connection with other human beings. And then also of the practical application of learning, the hand learning. So we often talk alongside our official motto, we use the phrase head, heart, hand, which comes from the 19th century educationalist Pestalozzi, who was a Swiss educational thinker, to achieve a balance. And we are constantly kind of watching out for whether or not we are achieving a balance and questioning whether or not what we're doing with our students is right for them, right for the world we're sending them out into, and right for what we know in terms of the research and our understanding of adolescent neuroscience or child neuroscience, child development, what we know about society today, what we know about how learning works more generally, and our understanding of things like technology as well. So that gives you a bit of a sense. I suppose I'd go on and say that from the outset, but throughout the history of the school, that kind of early legacy of questioning what had been a traditional approach and asking whether or not there was a better way of doing it is something that the school has continued to do over the decades. So one of the really exciting things for any educator when you come to Bedales is understanding that the history of the school is also, at least to some extent, the history of education in this country and globally for the last 130 years or so. So you mentioned Montessori, you mentioned Steiner, and Baddeley was a great correspondent with those educational thinkers. We continue to be correspondents with the educational world in the 21st century, and we calibrate what we do here with thinkers both all around the UK, but also internationally, whether they be educationalists or whether they be scientists or society's leaders or politicians. All of those things enliven our thinking about education, and they help us deliver something which we think is even better for our students. And so there is a constant sense of innovation in our school, and that's one of our founding principles.
And Bedales is different to many other schools in as much as it's got a very informal atmosphere with no uniform. Teachers are addressed by their first names, as I've already mentioned. What impact do you feel this has on the school community, and how does it benefit pupils?
Before I answer that question, I might push back a little bit on the premise of your question. You say that Bedales is different to many other schools in its informality. I think certainly for any of your international listeners, particularly if they're in North America or if they're in continental Europe, they will find what you described there as perfectly normal and mainstream, and things which have been normal and mainstream since, in many cases, the 1970s. The fact that in the UK, and often actually in other countries around the world which maybe were controlled in colonial times by the UK, then the legacy of uniform and formality is something which continues to this day. But certainly in the 21st century, even in the UK, when you look at the world of work outside of education, then that sense of formality, that sense of, dare I say it, stuffiness or rigidity is something which is increasingly rare. I mean no disrespect to these two professions, but generally you only really see men in suits if they are male, if they're undertakers or if they're estate agents. In most other professions, in most other occupations, the suit and the tie or the blazer are very much items of clothing of the past. And I suppose that's where, there is an element to which, things go around and come around. But for us, we feel that we're very much in tune with maybe not most UK schools, but we're in tune with most of the world of work and most of the North America and continental Europe. In terms of the impact of what it has on our community, then one, it allows them to be more used to being themselves rather than sometimes literally squashing themselves into an oversized blazer because you want to get a blazer that's going to last them a few years, or having to wear a kilt, which means that they maybe are more reluctant to take a more active approach to being on the campus, climbing trees or even walking up and down staircases because they're being forced to wear clothing which maybe restricts their ability to feel comfortable and move around freely. It also allows them, where they want to explore their sense of self. Now, for some of our students, they essentially choose what is a de facto adolescent uniform, i.e. they wear jeans, they wear trainers, they wear a T-shirt and a hoodie or a jumper of a fairly nondescript variety, which means they don't really stand out from the crowd. Sometimes they might wear their sports kit before they then go off to do a sports fixture or a sports match. And for those students at that particular time, or maybe throughout their school education, it's not really necessarily the conduit through which they're going to express themselves. But for some of our other students, they choose to express themselves in lots of different ways. And we have students who are very successful when they leave us in the world of fashion or other creative arts, or they just so happen to want to wear different types of clothing or express their character in types of clothing. We certainly know, whether we like it or not, in the world of work, people will make provisional, superficial judgments about each other based on small signals that we give each other in terms of how we're presented. Whether that's fair or not is, a question. But at the same time, it is useful for young people to go out into the world having, in a safe place, been able to explore that.
Increasingly, there are St Paul's girls. I can think of quite a few very well-known schools. You're not the only one. You're not standalone.
It is also an indicator of a more profound thing, because clothing is merely superficial. It is an indicator of that sense of authenticity, but also of that sense of connectedness and the importance of relationships, albeit within a professional context between teachers and students. If you look at any studies into some of the most effective interventions in education, one of the most significant factors that can improve a young person's education is the quality of the relationship between teachers and students. And overly excessive, rigid structures and clothing and other things which inhibit connection between human beings in a shared endeavour will reduce the quality of the relationship and therefore will reduce the quality of the education.
Bedales had one of the first school councils established in 1916, and one student described the school as a very student-run community. Obviously, pupil voice is something that we discuss with many of the heads that we speak to. How important do you feel student voice is at Bedales, and why do you feel it's so important to nurture that?
So I talked earlier about this idea of balance and authority and agency for students. I think for us, student voice, not just necessarily through the student council, although that's an important way of us making what we're doing in our school environment is working well. And we know that feedback from lots of stakeholders, if you want to use that term, although it's a slightly corporate term, I'm not a great fan of it, but it might be helpful to think of it in that way, for any organization is a really useful and important way of ensuring that what you're doing is working well. And yes, obviously, adolescents or children have been on the planet for less time than adults have. But anyone who's worked in education will know that there is a great wisdom that comes from young people, sometimes a greater wisdom than adults dare express to each other. And so the voice of a young person in education at any age is one that's important to be part of the discussion. And if it's not there, then you're missing a trick. Now, that said, we're not what's called a fully democratic school, which is where students and staff have an equal voice. We are cognizant of the fact that there are pressures that young people are under that aren't the same as adults. We're also conscious that as adults, we have responsibilities within a school context, which our students don't have. That said, students have responsibilities for themselves and for their own learning. And actually, if you give them a controlled and appropriate amount of responsibility, they will rise to that challenge. And by giving them a voice, you're also helping them practice what it is to participate in a community. And then finally, you also engage them and give them a much greater sense of stake in their community, in their school. And one of the things we see, which, in all of the other schools I've worked in, I've never seen such an intense sense of connection to their former school, is our alumni. Just last Saturday, I had round to my house a group of old Bedalians who were playing a football match against our current sixth form footballers. A narrow victory to the alumni, 3-2, a goal in the last minute, very exciting. And it was just so powerful to hear their stories about school, but to see how much they still felt connected to our community. I suppose if you just see this school as a village, then, young people might go elsewhere when they grow up and move out of the village, but they will come back at lots of different times, at festival times and feast days and all the rest of it, or weddings and things, and they will still feel that connection to their home community, particularly if it's a strong and caring and warm-hearted community. And we see that in spades with our alumni.
Which is fantastic. One of the school's aims is to foster interest beyond the school, engaging with the local community and developing a national and international awareness, which you've already mentioned by bringing up the schools in America, etc. Could you tell us more about your partnership work and the impact of this?
Obviously, our not-for-profit status, our charitable status in the UK is important to us. There are legal obligations which go with that, but that status resonates very strongly with our ethos, which again is this idea of us as an individual school being part of a greater community, whether that be our connection with the community in the village that we are part of, the village of Steep. So our connection with the local primary school, with the local church, with local residents, our connection with Petersfield, the nearest town to us, the residents of Petersfield, the other local schools that we have very strong partnerships with, whether they be academic, whether they be extracurricular. So, we have a regular question time event where the local MP comes and does a kind of BBC style question time event with panelists who are students and the head teachers of various schools. And then the audience is often sixth form students who are particularly interested in politics. And we rehearse, again, real life scenarios, but on our campus, and we can facilitate that sometimes more easily for other schools than it is possible for those schools to do so. We also have strong connections even with our local primary schools. Come and use our swimming pool. We host the Petersfield Youth Theatre, which is a local performing arts charity. And in the holidays, they use our campus to put on amazing shows. And we have partnerships with local charities like the Rural Refugee Network, which supports refugees in the local area, and a local charity called the Fitzroy, which supports young people and adults with severe learning difficulties. So within the locality, that is an important part of us participating and engaging and supporting and being part of our community. But we also see ourselves, and particularly the way in which we exercise our charitable benefit to society is, albeit humbly, we seek to be an active participant in conversations about education, particularly within the UK, particularly within England, because obviously we're part of that ecosystem, but also internationally. And one of the things that we find very useful is stepping outside of the English bubble of education and looking at systems in, let's say, British Columbia in Canada. Canada has the highest performing English-speaking education systems in the world, according to the OECD rankings. We might look at Singapore. They have something called the integrated program, where the top 20% of their students in state high schools in Singapore don't do O-levels. They still do O-levels and A-levels. They just go straight through to A-levels. And so that mirrors what we're doing with our own curriculum, where we're kind of dialing down the importance of GCSEs at 16 because our students don't need them because they're not exiting education. And GCSEs don't serve them as well as our own curriculum, especially on A-level only pathway. And we really enjoy being part of that dialogue with educators from around the world. And we have people who visit us. We have hundreds of people, literally, who visit this school who are interested in what we do educationally. So about a year ago, we had 20 senior educational leaders from the People's Republic of China who came to visit the school via the Institute of Education in London, looking at us as a model of a more creative and individualistic approach to education that they might find in China. And they were fascinated by what they saw. It was slightly ironic that the school was founded very much inspired by principles of the Fabian Society, which was the precursor to the modern Labour Party. And I was talking to them about democracy and communitarian values. And it was interesting that as a slightly kind of interesting political moment. I won't say any more than that. But, we participate in conversations nationally in the UK about educational reform. So we submitted to the recent call for evidence for the curriculum and assessment review that's being currently conducted. Within the last year, we've given evidence to 3 different parliamentary committees, each one of them looking at different aspects of education. And you'll find references to Bedales in Hansard in the last 12 months. We're part of the Rethinking Assessment organisation, which is a campaign group which is doing exactly what it says on the tin, campaigning to reform assessment. And we are very active in welcoming people who are looking to learn lessons from us and see what we do and to apply that in their own context, in their own way.
Quite inspirational. Bedales, you have several unusual traditions, such as jaw, which takes the place of chapel in more traditional English schools, certainly. Could you tell us about jaw and what it entails?
The word jaw, it has got nothing to do with sharks. It's actually a far more benign experience maybe than the name suggests. It comes from, again, a slightly old-fashioned term for jawing, as in moving your jaw up and down when you talk. It's a way of maybe informally talking about things. It was a term coined by John Badley. And while we have to be careful about being slaves to tradition, this is a tradition which has stood the test of time, in that one of the founding principles of the school was to push back against the idea that a school should, in choosing one specific religious denomination for its chapel, or even any religion, should, by implication, impose a hierarchy or priority of religious or spiritual beliefs. Now, this was not because the founding head of the school was not religious himself. He was actually a profoundly Christian man. And that was a very important part of his identity. And you can see a lot of that Judeo-Christian moral code implicit in what we do. But Badley and we still today believe that it's important that we don't make up our students' minds as to what they should believe. It is for us to empower them to be critical thinkers and to be confident in knowing what they believe. And for us to support them, whether they have no faith or whether they have any individual faith, whatever kind of faith that looks like. And so we have had a strong tradition, and we continue to do so, of having students who come from lots of religious backgrounds. We have a particularly strong tradition of welcoming Jewish families, and we're very proud of that. But we also have plenty of students and families who have no religious faith at all, or have a very abstract sense of what that means in terms of spirituality. The point of jaw is, on some levels, a statutory point, which is to fulfill our duty to provide spiritual and moral education to our students. But it is maybe more profoundly a place where we expose our students to a variety of different ideas and beliefs of a profound nature. And we want them to engage in a program which they find really stimulating, which challenges them and their beliefs and makes them really explore what they fundamentally believe in, rather than maybe what they've just inherited or what they assume to be what everyone thinks. And I suppose that thread of critical thinking is a really important part of what makes Bedales Bedales. We're not afraid in this school to ask challenging questions. Actually, far from being afraid, we encourage everyone in the community, whether it be students, staff, or parents, or old Bedalians, to ask challenging questions. And believe you me, they do on a regular basis. And while sometimes it takes a lot of energy and I have to think really carefully and deeply about what's being asked of me, it always comes from a place of respect. And it is always something that I really profoundly welcome, even if in the moment I might be taken aback because it's a tough question. We had an open morning actually on Saturday where we asked a couple of questions which were really profound. So one question was, how is the school dealing with colonialism and post-colonialism? And we had an interesting discussion about that. And again, a really profound one, a really philosophical one. And then another question we were asked, and this was directed at the 2 students who were on the panel, was, how has the school failed you in your time at Bedales? Now, some people would have been horrified at that question even being asked, and being asked in front of prospective families. You could imagine that it could potentially be a PR disaster maybe. But in our case, actually, it's a tough question. It's one which is challenging to answer. But to be fair to the students, they absolutely nailed the answer and showed the audience that our students are capable of responding to difficult questions, even ones which they weren't expecting. I think the final thing to say about jaw before I finish on that, which is another part of the tradition, is that like our assemblies, which also happen once a week, at the end of every jaw, the teachers line up on the way out to the door. And then as they leave, every student will shake the hands of every member of staff as they leave. And while it's fairly brief, because we've got nearly 500 students in the senior school, and so you can imagine how many hands that is to shake. Normally we have a split of 50% staff in the assembly and 50% staff in the jaw. But even just for that brief moment, each member of the community connects with each other. And that kind of physical connection, that kind of recognizing each other is a really important point at which we connect and reaffirm our sense of community. And while it is symbolic, it is also useful. I get to see all the students twice a week. I get to connect with them and to remind myself who they are. You pick up all sorts of things, even from just a brief handshake. And that's a really special and unusual part of a secondary school experience, I think.
People probably know about this, but you offer the Bedales assessed courses. Latimer obviously also are now doing their own GCSE option. And it's obviously project-based learning alongside core GCSEs. What led to this decision to offer different assessments and qualification types, and what impact has it had on the pupils?
Just one little clarification about that. You're right, we offer Bedales assessed courses, and you're right that project-based learning is part of the assessment type, but we do use a wide range of assessment in our BACs. So we do, for example, do high-stakes terminal tests at the end of those courses, if that's relevant and if that's useful for those individual subjects. But that's always going to be part of a broader range of assessment types. But yes, certainly real-world learning or project-based learning, where appropriate within individual subjects, can be part of what we do as well. The decision was one made many years before I became head. It was the thing that first interested me in Bedales. That was the reason why I first came to visit, as you note, when I was working at Latimer Upper. But yes, we first started moving away from GCSEs in 2005. And that decision, even then, was because we felt for our students that GCSEs just weren't delivering what was best in terms of stretching and challenging, and also being true to our students in their educational pathway towards A-levels and towards very selective and challenging institutions to apply for. One of the things which is slightly different in terms of the destinations for Bedales students when they leave here, 75% of our students go off to universities like Bristol and Edinburgh and Durham and Oxford and Cambridge and Leeds and NYU in New York, or Berkeley, or Northeastern in Boston, or the Sorbonne or Boccioni in Italy, or Trinity College Dublin. Lots of places, both in the UK and internationally, which are very selective, very high performing, very academic. And then about 25% of our students will go to the most selective, creative higher education institutions, whether that be the Royal College of Music, whether that be Kingston or Falmouth Colleges of Art, whether it be the Jacques Lecoq Circus School in Avignon, places which are the top of their game in those respective worlds, but are more down a creative pathway, always selective, always very hard to get into, but with that kind of creative focus. Interestingly, institutions like that will always also, as well as the creative side, will have a strong theoretical focus in their approach to those disciplines as well. But yeah, for our students, whether they're going off to read maths at Warwick or whether they're going to do circus skills in Avignon, they will benefit, from our perspective, from doing a wider range of assessments than just 33 hours worth of exams at the end of year 11 and hardly anything else in any other subjects. We also feel that by reducing the stakes, so they're not high stakes external assessments, we're actually enabling us and our students to spend more time on learning and less time on doing mocks and doing study leave and doing those 33 hours of exams and teaching to the test, which has become this arms race in our country and in other countries recently. There is an excessive expectation or desire to measure young people and to do so excessively frequently, particularly in the state sector, but even in the independent sector. That leads to a lot of lost time for her learning. And it also means that the curriculum and the education experience for young people is increasingly dispiriting and doesn't serve their needs well. In our students' case, they're going off to A-levels, they're going to very selective pathways. GCSEs, the General Certificate of Secondary Education, doesn't deliver enough for them. We know that, and you hear this from a lot of educational unions and a lot of other people in education in the UK, that there's something called the forgotten third at the other end of the academic spectrum, where they probably need a more applied, a more tailored program, one which is more flexible to them as individuals, but one which actually is more real to them than something which is perhaps slightly abstract or doesn't speak to them. And that's not about intellectual or class snobbery, that's just about difference. And it's about understanding that different young people need different pathways. And unfortunately, a one-size-fits-all sort of approach, especially at 16, it has a stranglehold on education at the moment. And we in the independent sector, and particularly at Bedales, wanted to exercise our independence. We feel that's what our students deserve. We feel that's what other students deserve as well. And we would like to see more of that elsewhere. But at least we can deliver something and make it real, and that we have a strong track record of doing that. over the last nearly 20 years now, which people look to and can see that is successful. Our success rate for students in access to university is really strong.
The school website highlights the importance of learning to live in a changing world. How are you preparing pupils at Bedales to thrive in their futures? I think you've talked about this a bit already, but in a very fast changing world, which it is now.
I mean, like other heads, we have a digital curriculum. Students have one-to-one devices, although they are managed by the school rather than students having total freedom. We have, like most other schools, a fairly restrictive approach to smartphones up until the age of 16, and even further up in the school, and even for adults, it is still restricted because we know that there is a balance to be struck there, and there are certainly dangers there. At the same time, being a school which is open to innovation and having more control over more of our curriculum for longer, we are able to move more rapidly. We can be more agile in terms of responding to changes that we see. So just conceptually, our approach to education is such that we will ask questions about what we're doing. So even just this morning, we were at a senior team meeting for the senior school reflecting on the use of AI in terms of generated communication or proofreading work in terms of reports or communications that we might send home to parents, some of the ethical issues around that, but also the fact that it's a useful tool. And we know that a lot of our parents use AI in their professional environments in order to not write stuff for them, but just to use as a tool for processing information and things like that. We were reflecting particularly on reporting, and we were asking questions about, well, is the current paradigm in reporting that we follow, which is very similar to other schools, is that the way to do it? And we explored the idea of whether AI could assist us in that, although there are obviously dangers about becoming depersonalized. But then we also have the courage to say, well, actually, what do we think about written reports? How effective are they? How often do they get read? What do people really think about them, and what are we trying to achieve when we write a report? And actually, is a report a bit of a relic in the 21st century, because we used to be much more of a text-based society than we are today, in which case maybe we don't need written reports as much. Maybe actually we need different kinds of reports, whether they're video reports, whether they're in-person presentations, whether, like this podcast, it's an audio file that you receive. And so we have that legacy of always asking questions, and we have the agility to be able to maybe respond to those questions quicker than other institutions. I think the final thing to say, though, which actually is something which doesn't age, is that focus on the individual, and particularly the humanity of the individual young people in our community. Now, more than ever, we need to address the humanity in education rather than just the mechanics or the robotics of education. A system in the 19th century which was fairly industrialized, fairly standardized, fairly robotic was appropriate then. But there are massive questions about whether that is either appropriate or even a responsible form of education to be giving young people today. And certainly what we do here, we feel, is a much better balance than what you find in a more mechanical system of education.
And finally, what are your plans and hopes for the future of Bedales School?
Well, I mean, I have to be careful now. As you can tell that I can talk quite a lot, so I have to be careful about being concise now. We did spend a long time after my first year as head. We did a really long exercise in planning a 10-year strategic plan. Most schools would normally do maybe 3 or 5 years, but we felt that actually having 10 years gave us a scope to be more ambitious, but also to maybe grow in a way that was more organic and more solid rather than maybe hothousey or driven by an individual person's time frame or their particular career goals. While obviously the individual is important in our community, at the same time, this is a collective endeavor in terms of what we achieve. And 10 years has been a really good time frame for us to think broadly and healthily about growth and change. So some of the headlines, some of them we've already touched on. So we currently have a sort of 50-50 model of BACs and GCSEs. By 2029 or maybe 2030, depending on how we get on, we will have moved to a 2 GCSE model, just English and maths. It's already progressing really well. We're really excited about the work we're doing in modern foreign languages and sciences, and we are on track to be ready for the 2029 date. But it's good for us to be aware that we need to make sure that we're going to be ready to deliver the curriculum of the same high quality as the other things that we already do. But that's going to be a big move. After that, we'll probably turn our attention to our sixth form curriculum. We're interested to see what's happening with the IB organisation's current exploration of a slightly alternative model at the diploma level for the final 2 years of high school. There's still problems with a large monolithic organisation in the IB organisation, however much its ideals are great and however much there is quality in its offer. But certainly if they could maybe be more flexible, that might be an organisation we might be interested in working with. We are looking to move our boarding provision to a fully co-educational provision. So we currently have a co-educational boarding house in the final year 13 of our boarding school and also in years 7 and 8. So you have a girls' floor and a boys' floor with clear separations and doors which automatically close at a certain time in the evening, and some very clear protocols about the movement around those buildings. But we are a co-ed school. If you go to people's houses, they don't have a girls' wing and a boys' wing, or a separate house for the women and a separate house for the men. Well, they might do in a few countries around the world, but certainly not in the UK. So for us, we're looking to replicate both a home environment, but on a different scale, but also the world that they're going into. And we feel that that's part of their education to understand and have the choice to either be in a single-sex space or in a co-educational communal space, depending on what they want to do. So that's the work of the next few years. We're also looking to make more formal the educational outreach work we do in establishing a Bedales Centre for Innovation, which is a sort of university-level study centre, engaging with academics, engaging with fellow educationalists, leveraging our really fascinating archive and opening it up to a broader audience in order to facilitate conversations about education for the future. I suppose finally, another thing to talk about, maybe two more which are connected to our community. We want to double the number of means-tested bursaries. We already have a sixth of our students who are on some form or other of means-tested bursaries, which for a school our size and age is punching above its weight. But we want to double that number, especially the full 110% bursaries that we have. And then finally, we also want to be even more sensitive to the environment that we're in. We've always been founded in a very agrarian context. Not that we're an agricultural college, but that really helps us find balance. And we want to tread even more lightly on the planet that we inhabit and protect it even more. So reducing our energy consumption even more and ensuring that our students really understand the importance of the environment and how to live healthily within it.
I hope to come and visit soon. It sounds absolutely inspirational, everything that's going on at Bedales. And thank you very much for giving up your time to speak to us.
You're more than welcome, Chloe, and you'd always be welcome.